and pedestrians and drivers. Today's episode is going to explore a common type of crash. Driver overtakes a bicyclist or passes too closely. We're going to be talking about this crash scenario, what we know about it, and how we can use different strategies to prevent it from happening. We're excited that you all are here to talk about this important topic with us. Joining us today to shed light on this issue are our three panelists. I'll introduce them now. Libby Thomas, Ken McLeod, and Bill Schulteis. Libby Thomas is a senior research associate at the University of North Carolina's Highway Safety Research Center, where her primary focus areas include bicycle and pedestrian safety and crash causes. Libby has served as the principal investigator or key researcher on a number of national, state, and local studies examining roadway and behavioral crash factors and identifying appropriate countermeasures. She's also conducted pedestrian and bicyclist safety and access research, working with agency representatives and project staff to develop evidence-based case studies, published guides, and interactive tools and resources to help states and communities make safety improvements. We're excited to have Libby here with us today. Ken McLeod is the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. Founded in 1880, the League works with its more than 350 member advocacy organizations to build a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. The Bicycle-Friendly State Program promotes awareness, best practices, and action by state departments of transportation and state legislatures by ranking each state and providing resources on state-level bicycling-related policies. Ken started with the League in 2012 after graduating from William & Mary Law School, creating the Bike Law University series that provided comparative legal research on 13 bicycle-related laws. We're excited to have Ken here with us today to shed some light on the policy angle with respect to this topic. Finally, Bill Schulteis is a registered professional engineer and director of Tool Design Group's Sustainable Safety Practice. He works with city and state DOTs throughout North America to provide safety performance, to improve the safety performance of streets and enhance the livability of communities. He believes strongly in the engineering profession's ethical duty to enhance the health, safety, and welfare of the public, and has been working to improve design guidance to improve the profession's ability to achieve these goals. He's the co-author of numerous industry standard street design guides, including the AASHTO Bicycle Guide, the MUTCD, and the Massachusetts DOT Separated Bike Lane Guide. We're really grateful to have all the panelists here with us today, and especially grateful that you all were able to join us. I wanted to take a few minutes to cover some housekeeping items for those of you who may be new to PBIC webinars. I'd like to remind everyone that as attendees today, you won't have the ability to speak, though you do have the ability to submit questions and comments to us using the questions pod. We hope you will do that throughout the session, especially toward the end when we have some time set aside, 25 to 30 minutes or so, to answer some questions and get some discussion going. So we'll be fielding those questions throughout the webinar, and we'll respond to them during that time. We'll be posting, actually have already posted presentation slides to our archive page. So pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can navigate to our archive page from that location. You can find the webinar slides we're going to present today that will be presented today in PDF format. Later today, this page will also be, there will also be posted a video recording of the webinar in case you would like to refer back to it. All this information will come to you later today in an email about an hour after the webinar concludes. It will also include a link to your certificate of attendance that you can generate. It's important to know that if you're joining with a small group, please forward that email to the others who are in your group so that they can also get a certificate of attendance for the webinar. The webinar has also been approved for 1.5 CM credits. So if you're a planner and are used to claiming those credits, please visit the event calendar for more information about those. And you can find out more about PBIC webinars that are coming up at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can follow us on social media. We'll be active today using hashtag PBIC webinar. You can sign up for our newsletter, all good ways to keep track of the series that we have going on. We've got one more episode scheduled in this series. It's coming up on Thursday. We're going to be talking about the multiple threat crash involving pedestrians at uncontrolled crossing locations. If this is a topic that interests you, I'd encourage you to sign up. I'll be sharing the registration link a little bit later today. And we have, as I mentioned, 2 more webinars planned in this series that are at this point unscheduled, but they will be coming up later this summer. So keep an eye out for those. I want to, before we get too much further, take an attendance poll. We're just curious to know how many people are out there. Take a moment if you don't mind, and please share this information with us. If it's just you attending, if you've got a small group with you or a bit larger group, we're just curious about the sizes of the groups that are attending our webinars. I'll leave this open for just a few more seconds, and then we'll move right along with our presentations. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll now. We appreciate your feedback and your vote there. Continuing along with the topic today, as you may know, PBIC just released a series of animations to make it easier for law enforcement, driver education instructors, advocates, and transportation professionals to engage others in dialogue about common types of crashes that may occur between drivers, pedestrians, and bicyclists. The videos that are available at pedbikeinfo.org/crash videos focus on behaviors by road users that can help prevent crashes. The same webpage also includes some suggestions for how different professionals, advocates, and others can use these animations. We'd like to encourage you all to visit these pages, to take a look at these animations, consider sharing them with others and using them in your own work. We're going to be focusing today on this driver overtaking bicyclist crash. We're going to focus our time really on policy measures and design measures that can really help prevent it. As you know, design has a big influence on our behavior, so we want to be sure we discuss this crash type with consideration to all the different ways that we can go about preventing it. These slides show some clips from the animation of the overtaking crash scenario. The crash often stems from a motorist passing the bicyclist too closely, either striking the bicyclist or causing the bicyclist to lose control or balance. The animations offer ideas for safety messages and recommendations related to safe passing distances and other rules of the road. But we do encourage you to watch the animations after the webinar. Right now, what I'd like to do is turn things over to Libby Thomas, who's going to start off by sharing a little bit of information about what we know about this problem from crash data that we have access to. So, Libby, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Dan, and it's a privilege to be here with you today and share a little bit about what we know and what we don't know. We need to get into that later on. So just first of all, I just want to share with you a breakdown of rural, urban, and intersection, non-intersection crashes from a couple of jurisdictions. We've had access for these analyses to, North Carolina has been typing pedestrian and bicycle crashes since 1997. So we use the most recent 5 years of crashes for a lot of these comparisons today to fatality data for the whole U.S., and I'll show you those in just a moment. So North Carolina, we see that about 72% of all severity of crashes reported are occurring in urban areas, and more of those are occurring at intersection locations overall, especially in urban areas, as you can see there. So in total, about 51% of crashes overall occur in urban areas with, at intersections, with 72% overall being in urban locations. But in fatalities, when we look at the data from the whole nation, we see a little bit of switching in those trends. There's still a majority of fatalities occurring in urban areas at 69%. But non-intersection locations account for 60% of the total when you add the 38% and the 22% together that you see in the bottom row there for non-intersection locations. And those are a higher proportion of fatalities, as you can see, in both urban and rural areas. So although we can't say that North Carolina is representative of all states and the type of distribution you might see in other states, it kind of suggests that non-intersection crash types are overrepresented for more severe outcomes when we compare what we see for the fatality data. So indeed, when we take a look, the folks at NHTSA have been coding all pedestrian and bicycle crashes since 2014. There was an earlier effort at coding, and those data, they wanted to make some improvements and corrections in their process. So they took those data down, and they started up again in 2014 after making sure they had good coding reliability and such. So what we find when we rank these crash types is that the motorist overtaking bicyclist is the #1 most frequent type of crash that results in a bicyclist fatality nationwide. And again, there we're showing some comparisons to North Carolina, this time just the fatal and disabling type crashes, or what many states refer to as the K or the A types of crashes. So again, that's the #1 rank when we look at that for North Carolina at 37%, and then showing the all severity there. It's still the #1 rank, although it's a lower percentage of about 21% of all the crashes. So here we can see some more comparisons. So the U.S. fatalities, 28%, ranked #1. North Carolina fatal plus A, 37% all. And then another jurisdiction we had access to was Boulder, Colorado, so an urban area, and 23 of their total crashes, for a very low percentage in this case, only less than 2% of all of their crashes were this type, and that was 14. So that's an exception to these general urban and rural trends that we're seeing. We're looking at the U.S. fatalities from FARS, North Carolina data, whether it's the urban areas or rural areas. And then the other sample we're showing there is that study from the 1990s, a 6-state sample, which kind of sampled an even number of crashes from rural and urban areas, and they found that about 9% of total crashes were the motorist overtaking types. They grouped things a little bit differently there, so I tried to compensate for how the different crashes were grouped. So again, just to show you in a visual, the urban areas are less represented for the overtaking types, and the rural areas become more prominent for, and these are using the FARS data only here. So the total fatalities are more highly represented in rural areas, in urban areas, and then the motorist overtaking type is more highly represented in rural areas. Okay, so looking back even further, the 1977 study, again, a lot of people have cited that study, but again, when we look at the fatal crashes in that study, although it wasn't as highly represented for all severity of crashes, 38% of the fatal crashes were this type, the 6-state study, the current U.S. fatalities, and then North Carolina. So we're thinking, what is going on here with motorist overtaking crashes? We also have data for North Carolina going back to 1997, and I thought, it might be interesting just to look at the time trend over that period. And interestingly, the motorist overtaking type kind of increased, except for a couple of years where it bobbled downward, but in general, it came up from 68 in the first year of this period to 208 in 2015. So it's just been rising pretty steadily over this time period. Whereas on the top bar here, you can see the bobbling, even though the numbers are much higher, you can see a lot of up and down of bicycle crashes overall in our state. So again, North Carolina may not be representative of all states, but something clearly is going on here with this kind of increasing trend. And one more graphic shows both the numbers, the frequency in the blue line, and then as a percentage of all crashes. So it's been increasing as a percentage of all crashes in North Carolina too. So this slide shows we're focusing for most of the rest of the period on the fatalities, U.S. fatalities. And these are some statistics that are related to this crash type. So some of these factors come from the coding that the FARS analysts are using to code crash types. And while they're reviewing the crash reports, the summary, the narrative, all of that information, and any other supplemental information they have to try to code the crash type, they also indicate whether the bicyclist was indicated to be riding facing traffic, where they were riding, and some other factors we'll get into in just a minute, the location of the crash. So in general, this isn't that type of crash. There is a little bit, and that seems almost an anomaly, but motorist overtaking is generally the motorist overtaking from the rear of a bicyclist traveling in the same direction. In the data, it shows about 80% of those cyclists were riding in a shared travel lane, as best the coders could determine. A much lower percentage, I'll show you in a minute, were riding on bike lane paved shoulder types of facilities. A whopping 58% of these occurred under low or light conditions, mostly at night, under dark conditions, and about 5% involved cyclists under 18 years of age. So just for some additional information, the FARS coders also identified a lot of other parallel path types of crashes that they couldn't quite place what the specific circumstances are, and that accounted for a significant number. And you'll see some of the trends there associated with that. Wrong way, wrong side, or head-on types of collisions also accounted for 5% of all U.S. traffic fatalities. And obviously, in many of those cases, it was the bicyclist, and 82% of the time, the bicyclist was on the wrong side or facing the wrong way, with the motorist facing or being in the wrong lane the other 18% of the time. You might see why we have missing or unclear information a lot of times. Hit and run is a really big issue in bicyclist fatalities. More than about, let's see, 17% overall of the crash types involved a hit and run, and then 27% involved hit and run in this motorist overtaking type of crash. So that's really a serious problem, and obviously we're missing a lot of detailed information when the driver couldn't be identified or found in these types of fatalities. I'm sorry.
One more time. Click again.
Okay. Okay. All right. So just some of the environmental conditions. Again, I mentioned the role of darkness, but most of the time it was clear or cloudy and dry surface conditions. So we don't see rain or wet surfaces as being a huge percentage of this problem. These variables are also coded by the FARS analysts when they're reviewing the crash reports. So as best they could determine, as I mentioned already, 80% of the time the bicyclist was in a regular or shared travel lane. Overall types, it was 76%. So in fact, a little more often, the bicyclist was in a shared lane in this type of crash. Unfortunately, it's kind of a shame, but the bike lanes, paved shoulders, parking lanes are all grouped together by in this coding scheme. But about 19% of the time, the bicyclist was on that type of location, riding just before the crash. Very few cases where they indicated to be on a sidewalk or path and may have ridden out or something into the road just prior to the crash. Again, I mentioned this is not typically an intersection crash type, but some of them do happen at intersections or near an intersection or at an intersection. But it's generally a crash that will occur at segment locations. So these data are from crash reporting. They're not verified by the FARS analysts, but as best we can determine as what's reported in the data, most of these collisions occur on two-way undivided roads, and you can see some of the other road types or configurations indicated there, with about 18% on two-way roads that are divided, but not by a raised or median with a barrier. So then some two-way left turn lane is third with two-way continuous. Oh, I had that in twice. Apologies. Okay, and again, as best we can determine, most of these occur on two-lane roads. We suspect that not all of these data are entirely accurate because some agencies tend to code the number of lanes for divided versus undivided. But we do think that a large percentage of these occur on higher speed limit roads. You can see the distributions there with about, between these two together, 40 and higher, about 76% of all these fatalities seem to occur on roads with speed limits of 40 or more miles an hour. So just a quick summary then of what we've seen is that a majority of these collisions seem to occur on higher speed roads and at night or under low light conditions. A very significant percentage of them occur involving hit and run drivers. Most cyclists seem to be riding in a shared lane just prior to the crash. A majority of them occur in urban areas, but 41% occur in rural areas compared to 29% of all types occurring in rural areas. So rural areas do seem to be overrepresented for this type. However, rural and urban, we could get into the definitions, but they don't necessarily reflect the development intensity completely. Like in North Carolina, urban is defined as being within the bounds of a municipality, and the urban definition in FARS is based on FHWA's definition of urban. So that's just a quick summary of some of what the crash data show us, and now we'll move on so the other presenters can share their information.
That's great. Thanks so much, Libby. We had a few questions come in while you were presenting all that important data that let me know I didn't do a completely sufficient job describing the crash type to begin with. So I wanted to take a pause now while we're about to shift to another presentation. And Libby, I know you've done so much work in defining these, doing a lot of the coding in North Carolina and other places. So I wonder if you could take a quick stab at defining this crash type for us before we move forward.
Yes, thank you. I should have taken the time to do that. So for the purposes of these comparisons and such, we wanted to look at kind of what's considered a group type, but as I did mention, it does involve motorists coming up from behind a cyclist. They're either intentionally overtaking or passing or just catching up to the bicyclist. And they can occur in several ways, and we have some illustrations maybe later. We can, if we have a chance, we can bring those up. But they can occur by the motorist not detecting the bicyclist in time to avoid them, such as if they're approaching on a curve or at night, as we saw a lot of these happen at night, and they may just not see the bicyclists in time to avoid them. So that's one of the big ways that this can occur. Another way is as Dan showed in the animation, they just don't allow sufficient space, either lateral space or when they're first pulling out or pulling back in around the bicyclist. They just don't allow enough distance between them and the bike, and they inadvertently hit the bike. Another way is that sometimes the bicyclist may be riding ahead and then suddenly swerve to maybe avoid debris or an object on the road, another vehicle or such, and they may swerve into the path of the motorist as the motorist is overtaking. So those are some of the three main ways that we can sometimes detect in the crash data. Oftentimes we can't tell the exact circumstances, and so a large percentage of these tend to be coded as just, we don't know exactly which of those types of maneuvers it was. So that's why I tend to focus on the kind of combined crash type, which is more easily determined in all of these different data sets, and there tends to be more agreement between coders and such.
Sure.
So does that make sense?
It does, and that's really helpful. I think talking through some of those different scenarios you just outlined and how these crashes could happen are really important. I think your presentation unveiled a lot of issues about things we do and don't know, and it's all about the quality of our data. One more clarifying question before we move on to Ken McLeod's presentation is, the data you described are included from the United States on the fatality type data. Were those from years 2014 to 2016?
Yes.
Okay.
Hopefully we have the numbers,
I believe we did,
there somewhere.
Just one more clarifying question.
I should have repeated that each time. That's right. Fatalities for the U.S. 2014 to 16. For North Carolina, it was 2011 to 15, except for that trend that went back to 97.
Perfect.
And then for Boulder, we had data from 2008 to 14. So it overlapped, all three of these data sets overlapped somewhat with the years of forest data, but not perfectly.
Okay.
So we're not saying, we're not trying to make exact comparisons here, but just kind of look at differences among urban and rural and fatalities and crashes that don't necessarily lead to fatalities. And at least in North Carolina, we see a lot of overtaking crashes among all severity, but nationwide, this is really obviously a problem for fatal crashes.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. Ken, so what we're going to do now is, we've heard about the problem, we've heard a little bit about how it might happen. I would like to take a bit of a step back, and Ken McLeod is here to offer some ideas about policy level solutions to this, and we'll get into more roadway design solutions a little bit later. But Ken, the floor is yours whenever you're ready to go.
Thank you. Hopefully you can see my screen.
I do, yeah.
Great. So I'm Ken McLeod. I'm the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. If you have questions for me, you can reach me by email at ken@bikeleague.org or on Twitter at kenmcld. Really, the most common policy solution that we have for overtaking crashes is the throughput passing law. And simply, the throughput passing law defines a safe passing distance when overtaking a bicyclist as at least 3 feet. So this really addresses the type of crash where the motorist is able to see the bicyclist, identify that the bicyclist is there, but then fails to give enough space when overtaking and completing their overtaking of the bicyclist. And the throughput passing law as a policy solution addresses at least 2 problems. One is when there's an unclear state law protection for bicyclists, and then 2 is kind of the lack of public knowledge or culture about safely passing a bicyclist. So kind of this worst case scenario would be unclear state law protections for bicyclists. And this can happen because in most states, there's 2 laws that kind of cover bicyclists on the roadway as a vehicle, and gives them rights similar to a vehicle. So that's the law that defines a vehicle that may or may not define a bicycle as a vehicle. And then something that is referred to here as the R&D statute, which means rights and duties, which extends the rights and duties of a driver of a vehicle to a person operating a bicycle. So in a handful of states still, but it used to be more states, a bicycle is not defined as a vehicle. The safe distance law only mentions vehicles, and the rights and duties statute, since it refers to rights and duties applicable to a driver of a vehicle, doesn't expressly extend those rights and duties of the safe passing law, which only mentions the vehicle and not the driver of a vehicle. So this is just a handful of states at this point, but it's one of the reasons that we need to have this type of law, and that this clarification is very important. On the other side, the best case scenario is to have a law that is clear, enforceable, and well-known statewide. This little graphic is from Bike Delaware, who recently did the Bicycle Friendly Delaware Act that has really one of the best safe passing laws in the United States. It requires drivers to change lanes to pass, even on 2-lane roads, provided that it's not a sufficiently wide lane to be safely shared with a bicyclist. And if they, for some reason, don't change lanes to pass, they still have to give 3 feet, even when the lane is sufficiently wide. So that's a really good one that's clearly written so that people can put it on a bumper sticker. It's enforceable because it clearly defines what the law is. And Bike Delaware and others are really making a push to make sure that it's well known, well publicized. So that's what we want. So within our bicycle friendly state program, we have 5 bicycle friendly actions that we are really looking for every state to do. Within that, the safe passing law is one of those bicycle friendly actions. And we conceive of it as broader than 3 feet. So we're really looking for state laws that either set a safe distance in terms of feet, such as 3 feet, something that is a variable distance that might account for the speed or size of a passing vehicle to give more space to bicyclists in those circumstances, or a law similar to the law in Oregon or Rhode Island where the safe distance is defined as a distance sufficient to prevent contact with a person operating a bicycle if that person were to fall over. So those are the three types of laws that we're looking for states to adopt. Safe passing laws have really become prevalent over the last decade or so. So by our standards, which cover those three things that I just talked about, 35 states have a safe passing law. 4 states, including Delaware, which has one of the best, have updated their safe passing law or adopted a safe passing law for the first time since 2016. And we're still looking for those last 15 states to adopt a safe passing law that meets our criteria. And you can find a chart of all these state laws on our website under our Bike Law University resources. So this chart just kind of shows how safe passing laws have really taken off over the last decade and a half. So the first safe passing law was adopted in Wisconsin in 1973. Then not a lot happened for a long time. And then since 2006, at least one state has adopted a safe passing law each year. So that's really exciting to see that progress, to see the steady rise in the prevalence of safe passing laws. And hopefully that means that we have to wait for less than 15 years to get those last 15 states. But it's great to see these laws being adopted so often over the last decade and a half. So in terms of recent developments, there's been some good and there's been some bad. So the change lanes to pass language that kind of gives bicyclists kind of the same protection that would be offered to a car, where cars change lanes entirely to pass, is now in 3 states. As I said, in Delaware, it applies on 2-lane roads. In Nevada and Kentucky, it only applies on multi-lane roads. We're also seeing some developments that I would consider bad. So there's some carve-outs that limit the application of these laws to certain circumstances. So Alabama is a state that has that and really limits the application of the 3-foot law there. And then there's also just kind of unnecessary language that could limit the law, but doesn't necessarily limit the law. And California is an example there. It just kind of provides that if people can't give 3 feet, they slow down and give enough space kind of under a more reasonable standard. So it's harder to enforce. It doesn't necessarily change the overall law, but it may undermine it a little. So we're a little wary of that. Our model policy, which we have this model law that anyone can go to our website and find our model safe passing law. It has 4 basic features. So it does the change lanes to pass on multi-lane roads, as Nevada has or Kentucky has. It provides for a 3-foot minimum on 2-lane roads, which is the standard in most states. It clarifies that drivers can pass in no passing zones as long as they otherwise comply with laws. This kind of recognizes that bicyclists are smaller and slower than typical vehicles, so it's kind of easier to pass them, and it may be appropriate for drivers to pass in no passing zones where they wouldn't be able to pass a motor vehicle. And then it clarifies that a crash is evidence of a violation of the law. In a lot of cases, that'll be easy for an officer to say that it's not a violation of the law because most crashes aren't these overtaking crashes. But in the case that it's an overtaking crash, it reminds the officer that yes, this is a law and that they should enforce it. So that's kind of the baseline policy perspective. The hard part is implementation. So we've had a lot of growth in terms of states adopting the law over the last decade and a half, but we still have very limited data on law enforcement of the law and very limited studies about the safety effects of the law. So we're still building that evidence base that kind of shows best practices about how these laws should be enforced and what the real safety benefit of having these laws are. So I'm going to go through some implementation strategies that are kind of catching on. So one is a sensor-based enforcement. This is the Code-Axis C3 Feet device that is shown here. It includes, some sensors so that people can install them on their bikes and measure the passing distance of passing cars. It's been used by law enforcement in Chattanooga and Austin. It's been used for research on safe passing and verified by research. This article that is shown here was published in the ITU journal earlier this year. So this is a really great development that kind of provides an easy to implement way of telling if safe passing is happening. So there can be either feedback on road designs or feedback to law enforcement about what they should do to implement safe passing laws. Another emerging implementation strategy is video-based enforcement. So GoPro cameras, the Cyclic Fly 6 or similar action cameras provide high quality video that can be used to show safe passing or unsafe passing. It maybe doesn't show 3 feet or not 3 feet as well as the C3 feet device, but it can still show safe passing versus unsafe passing. And there's been a push by a group called cyclistvideoevidence.com to have law enforcement use video evidence to prosecute people, to send warning letters to people, and otherwise publicize that, yes, safe passing laws exist, and that when people break them, there should be a consequence. Law enforcement may or may not be receptive to you if you are riding with a camera and you bring this evidence to them, but you don't get anywhere without asking. So this is definitely another implementation strategy that people are looking towards. I'm kind of excited by this. NHTSA has a study ongoing about evaluating the enforcement of bicycle safety laws that includes safe passing laws. I don't know exactly what the outcomes of this will be, but my hope is that we get something like high visibility pedestrian crosswalk enforcement out of it, where there can be high visibility safe passing law enforcement campaigns where law enforcement uses something like the C3 feet device to measure safe passing, and then educates people who violate the law in a certain area, and then gives tickets after that education has occurred, and then follows up over time. And with high visibility pedestrian crosswalk enforcement, that was shown to have a long-term effect on behavior. So I would hope that this study kind of shows the same long-term effect on behavior through high visibility safe passing law enforcement. But that's total speculation and hope. So we'll see hopefully in a year or so what this study actually says. This isn't direct implementation, but it's something we need, and it's something that really led to a lot of the data that was discussed so well earlier in this webinar. So better reporting is really needed so that we can understand overtaking crashes better. So the NHTSA fatality analysis reporting system has done great in having those 3 years of typed crashes. The MUC, Model Minimum Uniform Crash Criteria, is kind of the basis of crash reporting. So to the extent that agencies can adopt better crash reporting forms, it'll give us better data on overtaking crashes and crashes generally. And then generally traffic safety enforcement data, data on citations, data on adjudication of citations could really be improved so that we know how many tickets are actually being issued in states with safe passing laws. Florida is one of the few states that has a statewide uniform citation report, and it shows typically between 300 and 500 safe passing violation citations are issued each year over the last 5 years or so. So it's great to have that data, but we need more states so we can do comparison of that data. A final emerging implementation strategy is just public education. This can be signage, this can be PSAs. Once we have these laws on the books, we need to use public education both in specific ways and kind of broader ways to really make it a culture of safe passing. Make sure that people are looking out for bicyclists and that when they see them, they give them the distance they need so that we can limit overtaking crashes. So if you're interested in safe passing law in your state, I would love to have you come check out our materials. We have a model law. We have a white paper that talks about how to get it adopted and implemented. And then our Bike Law University page has the safe passing law for all 50 states with citations. And just really, I want to stress, policy is only one part of protecting bicyclists. Safe passing laws are a part of, not an alternative to, a safe systems approach. We really need to realize that crashes and fatalities are preventable. There's a responsibility between the users and designers of our road systems. So even though safe passing laws are focused on motorist action, everyone, all users, and the designers, engineers, law enforcement that are involved in our traffic safety need to take a shared sense of responsibility to reduce crashes and fatalities. And I think that's a great segue to Bill and some of the other ways that we can make our system safer.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ken. That was a perfect segue, in fact. I will turn it right over to Bill. We've got a lot of good questions coming in. I want to table them for now. We've got them. I know exactly what some of these key issues you all are looking at are related to policy. So we'll come back to Ken during the Q&A. I'm going to move things right now to Bill Schulteis, who's going to carry us through some of these design strategies, how we can kind of round out this safe system. Bill, the screen is going to come to you right now. I'll let you know when I can see your screen, and we can move on from there. All right, perfect. You're all set, Bill.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Really glad to have you part of this important webinar. So again, I'm Bill Schulteis, the director of our sustainable safety practice at Tool Design Group. I've been working in this business for 20 years now, and have spent a lot of time thinking about this challenge and working on design guidance to try to improve safety outcomes for people in the built environment. So I'm going to give an overview today of what are the most common strategies to mitigate this crash type, and talk about some of the factors that you should be considering as part of that design. One of the first things I want to mention is that there's this statement that's made a lot that 94% of all crashes are due to human behavior, and I think that makes intuitive sense, that unless it's truly an accident or an act of God, that something happens to cause a crash, that in fact every crash is a result of some failing of human behavior, a mistake that's made on the roadway environment. So the reality is, if that's the situation that we're dealing with, is people making mistakes, then how do we develop policies and laws and designs that accommodate for the fact of human fallibility? And I think it's pretty obvious, again, if we had the ability to follow all the rules as human beings and operate perfectly in all environments, there'd essentially be almost no crashes. And I think this is one of the big hopes of a driverless car future, is that will take the human part of the operations out of the equation, and then we'll just have machines operating. It still leaves a lot of questions for people walking and biking in the roadway environment, however. You see some of this reflected in the way that crashes are reported in the media, and I think that the way crashes are reported in the media has a very large influence on the public's perception of what's causing some of these crashes to happen and what we can do about it. And you often see that the two most prominent statements made when there's a bike crash is discussion of whether the cyclist was wearing a helmet and what color clothing they were wearing. When looking at behaviors of cyclists, it's been talked about, but edge riding is a very common behavior when you have narrow streets or streets with high volumes of traffic or high speeds of traffic. And you'll see people kind of trying to shy away from that traffic and let vehicles pass. And here you can see a very close pass where the cyclist is operating very close to the curb, and it would take very little in the way of a mistake by either party to result in a crash in this situation. We have complex environments where the cyclists need to merge across multiple lanes, and again, as a small person on a bike, you're not as visible as a larger vehicle, regardless of the type of clothing you're wearing. You're a little bit harder to see in that environment. And here's some examples I'd like to show. You can find some of these if you search bicyclists being hit by cars, but increasingly with the the availability of helmet cameras, we're starting to see a lot more recordings made that are video evidence that Ken spoke of these crashes. And you can see here, this cyclist is operating in the center to the leftmost part of the travel lane, but this car that's in front of them in the white attempted to cut off the cyclist to get into the turn lane in front of the bus. and actually hit the cyclist, causing him to crash in front of the bus. And you can see as the cyclist lands, he ends up in the lane of traffic and is at great risk of being run over. I think thankfully here, the person was not run over. But you can see how motorist aggression or improper lane changing can cause kind of a sideswipe behavior, which I think falls under the categorization of hit from behind type of environment. A very common environment that we see throughout North America is the suburban environment. And I think Libby mentioned that there's a very high percentage of crashes that occur on higher speed roads over 40 miles an hour, and they tend to be in shared lanes. And this is a very common design of a roadway in the suburban environment, where there's really no separate accommodation for cyclists, and the speeds of traffic and volumes of traffic is such that when cyclists are out there, they tend to ride on the edge of the lanes. Here's another example of a rural road, which are quite another area of concern when it comes to hit from behind crashes. And in Tennessee, you can see that there's a cyclist that is biking on the left-hand side of the lane. He's actually riding with a friend of his. And it's reported in a newspaper article from last year where they were riding and had a great country road ride where they're riding side by side and controlling the lane actually. And they heard this vehicle in the white truck approaching them and honked the horn to advise them they were behind them. And then they could hear another car coming from behind and speeding up. And this car actually hit the cyclist in the leftmost portion of the lane. You can see here in this series of slides how rapidly it knocks him off his bicycle. And again, he's very lucky. He was able to walk away from this crash, but it took very little contact on the part of that motorist to knock him down into the lane. It was a hit and run. The motorist drove away, and thankfully that motorist was caught and I think is undergoing prosecution. But nonetheless, it generated some newspaper article, and what I found interesting in the article is the advice given. And I think a lot of us would agree that the advice given here on these bullets is common sense. You know, wear bright colored clothes to try to maximize your visibility, and that to remind both motorists that bicyclists have the same rights and responsibilities as drivers. And some other common sense advice here. But what I found troubling in reading the article is that the National Park Service is recommending that cyclists avoid this roadway during periods of high traffic volume, and also to avoid the roadway during conditions of darkness. And I think that raises a lot of questions about whether bicyclists in fact have the same rights and responsibilities if they're being told to not operate on these roadways, because the travel conditions are such that they're not safe for cycling at certain times of the day. And it really raises the question of whether bicycling is considered a legitimate mode of transportation. So when you kind of revisit this quote in the context of crashes as a result of human behavior, I think a colleague of mine from Northeastern, Dr. Firth, really summarizes this quite well and says, you know, a system that is safe only if people don't make mistakes is not a system that's made for human beings. And I think that's a very accurate statement, that we've built a roadway environment that is in fact is not accommodating the reality that people make mistakes. And so what can we do about it? First, we need to look at research, and we know that there's a connection between how cyclists feel and their sense of danger, that when they have near-miss experiences, it actually causes them to feel less safe. And what we find is when they report these near-miss experiences in places they say they feel unsafe, in many cases they actually are unsafe, and that their perceptions track quite closely to locations that actually have a safety problem over a period of time. And that's reflected on these images. On the left is where people reported feeling unsafe, and on the right is actually locations of crash history. And you can see how they are not perfect, but they generally line up closely. And then there's a significant body of evidence and numerous research studies that document there's a connection between these, and you'll see this in the PDF handout. We also find through research that at locations with higher volumes of traffic, higher operating speeds, that it's very common for cyclists to operate on the sidewalks. And here's an example study where they found 64% of the riders were actually operating on the sidewalk, and a high percent, 39%, were operating, in this case, on the sidewalk with traffic, and another 25% were operating on traffic going against traffic. And then a small percentage of cyclists are riding in the road-facing traffic. And we know through research that operating facing traffic increases your crash risk. Again, through research, we know that people have a great discomfort based on the speed, and we often observe this behavior, again, of people avoiding, even when we provide bike infrastructure, such as bike lanes, when they're on roads that are high volume or high speed, when there's an alternative sidewalk or path, that many people will choose to use that alternative if it's available, to increase their sense of safety and comfort. Further research shows that we can kind of put cyclists into our the general population in kind of comfort typologies and how comfortable they feel operating in different roadway environments. We find that it's a very narrow percentage, 4 to 7% of cyclists that will say they feel quite confident operating in most every condition of roadways. And it's a very large percentage of the population, 51 to 56, that say they'd like to avoid conditions such as I was just showing in the prior photographs, that they have a very low tolerance for traffic stress and sharing lanes with traffic operations. So the reality of how people feel in mixed traffic has a direct correlation to how they operate and the choice of whether they're willing to bicycle or not. And it has very important ramifications for the design decisions that we need to make. One of those is, who's your design user? And I think this is a fundamental question whenever we're doing design guidance. We're updating the AASHTO Bicycle Design Manual, and we're changing the design user. Historically, the design user in prior AASHTO guidance has been a rather confident adult male cyclist as the default design user, and it's going to shift. If we want to capture a larger percentage of the North American population, we need to build facilities that are actually the larger percentage of the population is interested in using it and are safe. And so the future edition of the AASHTO manual is going to shift this to be what's known as the interested but concerned cyclist as the default design user. It also has ramifications for the type of networks we provide. A low-stress bike network, which separates bikes from traffic on high-speed, high-volume roads, builds networks of low-volume shared streets and bike boulevards, is really going to be referred to as a low-stress bike network, and that'll be a network that really is geared towards serving the large percentage of the population that's willing to bicycle, which is estimated to be about 72% of the public. A basic bikeway network is really a system of standard bike lanes and shoulders where you're next to traffic but still separated, and that appeals to a smaller percentage of the population, generally the more confident and somewhat confident cyclists. And then the kind of ongoing shared lane conditions where you don't really provide any special accommodations appeals to the lowest percentage of the population of cyclists. So moving forward, there's a change in thinking about the approach, and Ken mentioned this. There's a shift of thinking that we need to take a sustainable safety approach to our roadway design, and that's consistent with Vision Zero principles. One is functionality of the roadways, that the road, with the decisions we make for choosing a bike facility, should match the context of the roadway. Two is homogeneity, and that it's really inappropriate to mix cyclists that are riding bikes in with trucks and buses and vehicles that are much larger than them, as you see in this photograph, or vehicles operating at a significant difference in operating speed because it increases danger substantially to the users. And for goodness, we need designs that actually allow mistakes to happen and not result in fatalities or serious injuries. Lastly, predictability, so that when we have designs, we have consistent roadway designs where you anticipate and understand what people are going to do on the roadway, which can simplify decision making. And last, again, the idea of awareness, and it's again ties closely to predictability, making things very clear how to operate. So I'll give you a few examples of this, applying this principle. When you have cyclists today operating in shared lanes, and you have higher volume and higher speed operation of road, and they don't have separate space, it creates this situation of unpredictability of how people are going to behave, leads to close passing, makes it uncomfortable, and can increase frustration for all parties on the operating roadway. By adding a stripe in a bike lane, this is adding in the elements of forgiveness. People have their own space, a little bit more room to operate if they make a mistake, not be hit. Predictability of understanding to where to expect people, and then awareness where the permanent presence of the shoulder, bike lane, or other facility actually reminds people to be expecting cyclists in the roadway environment. Another aspect of sustainable safety is really being clear that we have to consider daytime as well as night. And since we have a very high percentage of crashes occurring at night, we need to have designs that accommodate cyclists at night. When I was on this road traveling with my wife, I was sitting in the passenger seat and I noticed bikes may use full lane signs. And I was really spending some time thinking about, would my wife have the ability to see and react to a cyclist when she's operating on this roadway at 40 miles an hour and have time to react to them? And I think the reality is it would be challenging in this environment to, one, see a cyclist and then have the ability to react when all the other lanes of traffic are operating at high speed and high volume. And so we can see why it makes sense that we have a high percentage of crashes occurring, these higher speed roads and in conditions of darkness. Again, during the day, we have challenges of roadway. This is in the city limits of Gainesville, Florida, but the road's actually a transition into the city, and it's posted at 55 miles an hour. We have very long turn lanes, and you can see that motorist encroachment and operation over that bike lane occurs over quite a long distance, and it's very unpredictable of where they're going to merge into your space. You take that same condition at night, and it can become very challenging to see a cyclist and understand where they're going to be, and to really establish that set of expectations when they're in that road environment dealing with high-speed merging and weaving traffic. So moving forward, how do we think about this? How do we apply it? If we're going to design for the interest of a concern as the primary user, we need to be aware of their concerns about their safety, and that when overtaking crashes is the #1 cause of fatalities in urban and rural areas, I think it's not an unreasonable concern on the part of the general public for that to influence their decision to bike or not, which then in turn, their decision to bike can be influenced by the type of facility provided. So the forthcoming AASHTO guide is going to propose some guidance that's based on the systemic safety, sustainable safety principles of thinking about having appropriate combinations of vehicle volume and speed combined with different types of bike facilities. So as you can see in this chart, that as the vehicle speeds increase or as the volume of traffic increases, there's increasing levels of separation. There's also going to be other considerations that are thought about when you're making this decision to choose a type of facility as listed here on the bullets. So we thought we'd give a couple examples. In lower speed environments, such as local streets or collector streets, where speeds are lower, maybe 25 miles an hour, and vehicle speeds are below 3,000, you can look at this red dot on our chart. This might be a situation where there's traffic calming, or bike boulevard, as shown as this photograph, could be a very fine example for a shared operating experience between bicyclists and motorists. But as the speeds increase, it becomes more appealing to all users to provide bike lanes, to have a separate operating space, as shown here in this photograph. We have a one-way collector street where the vehicle speeds are higher, the vehicle volumes are higher. And again, as the vehicle volumes get even higher, the speeds get higher, and even if the speeds are not necessarily higher, but that the volumes are very intense, such as this location in Boston, and now this is where you start to introduce the concept of physical separation, as can be seen here with the flexible delineators to create a separated bike lane. So this chart applies in urban, suburban, and rural town context. This will be a starting point when you're thinking about facility selection in different land use contexts from the AASHTO perspective. There's also consideration to be had of whether, if you're going to separate bicyclists from traffic, whether it's a separated bike lane or to provide a shared use path. And a key consideration in its decision point is context of where you are. Is it a city, and how many pedestrians are using the facility? If it's a location where there's a lot of pedestrians, and mixing bicyclists and pedestrians can cause safety challenges and discomfort challenges for both users. As you can see in these photographs, when you have less crowding, like on the left, you can provide a higher level of service and bikes and pedestrians can mix. But as the photo in the middle shows, as the volumes come up, you can really degrade the experience for all users and introduce a lot of safety challenges. You reach that kind of point where you have that much volume of pedestrians and cyclists, it's much better to provide facilities that separate bicyclists and pedestrians on those facilities. It's generating a lot of discussion, and I think a fundamental challenge we've had historically when it comes to our shared use paths is we've under-designed them. We talk about them as being bike paths, and then they're so popular with people walking that they're too narrow. And I think what we've forgotten about in our business is that walking and cycling are inherently social activities. And you look at this photograph, everybody is walking or cycling next to a friend, and we're not designing our facilities to accommodate the social aspect of bicycling and walking. To accommodate them safely and to accommodate this behavior, our facilities need to be wider. This is represented here on a separated bike lane in Cambridge. You can see the pedestrians walking side by side fill the space of the sidewalk. The cyclists operating side by side fill the width of the bike lane and actually are getting close to its operational edges. And so this is a characteristic, and it's a very normal human behavior that should be accounted for in design. The AASHTO guide is going to explain this concept of operating space and shy space and really emphasize its relationship to comfort and safety, and emphasize that when you're talking about minimum widths, that there can be safety trade-offs when you're designing facilities to the minimum, and that it's not desirable to use the minimums as the default treatment, and it's actually much safer for the users to be looking at more desirable and preferable widths. So you can see this contrast, the photo on the left versus the right, that additional widths where we have the space can improve the safety and comfort for the cyclists. Again, you can see the impact of this. When you have minimum widths, you can accommodate occasional passing, but it's really too narrow for occasional passing. You really need a little bit more space for it to be comfortable. And when someone has to pass, both cyclists need to operate on the edges of their path, which can increase their crash risk. By just a slight widening, you can actually create a design that allows cyclists to operate safely side by side without risk of crashing by hitting objects on the left side or right side of their operating space. Really quick, the common types of treatments we're using to separate, I think the reality in a lot of environments is there's a lot of sidewalk bicycling where the streets are felt to be unsafe for all ages and abilities. You see a lot of children operating on sidewalks, and we need to be looking for locations where this behavior is occurring and ask ourselves some hard questions of why are so many people operating on the sidewalks instead of the street, and what can we do to make the street design safe or provide an alternate bikeway to have cyclists operate there instead of on the sidewalk. Side paths, another common treatment for separating, but here's an example where you really need to have a certain amount of width for it to operate safely. It's really important to have a buffer between the path and the roadway to give you the space to design a proper facility that has nice transitions at driveways, and it can improve the safety outcomes of the facility. When you don't have a buffer, such as this location, it can actually degrade the performance of the facility, degrade the user experience operating on it, and decrease their safety at intersections. Here's an example of a bike lane where it's insufficient width. It's on a pretty busy arterial, high speed. They've tried to include the gutter into the operating width. They've designated, you can see the cyclist is avoiding it and operating on the wider sidewalk because they don't feel like that bike lane is safe, and in fact, it may not be if the gutter seam is not smooth. It can lead to crashes. It also creates an expectation on the part of motorists that cyclists will be operating in that confined space, which is too narrow. Here's an example of the impact of speed, and I think we really discount this a lot. When you have a high speed differential, and this is a minimum width bike lane, it can really degrade the experience of the cyclist. And this is a posted 35-mile-an-hour roadway, which is not uncommon in urban areas, but we all realize that a lot of people operate at 5, 10, and sometimes 15 miles an hour higher than the posted speed in roadways designed like this. So here's an example of another context where it's a lower speed street, but you can see that the concept of forgiveness is not here. That these children operating the bike lane are really close to the parked vehicles, or close to this bus. If any party makes any small mistake, the consequences could be quite serious for these children, for the operator of the bus, who would feel really terrible if they were to hit one of these cyclists, And so it degrades the comfort and experience of the facility when they're built this narrow, or when you have vulnerable users such as these younger children operating in these types of environments next to heavy vehicles. When you get to higher speed roads, you can see the big difference that a buffer can make. Again, you can see that at night, a buffer can make a big difference in a person's safety by giving them more separation to traffic, improving that margin of error, increasing the forgiveness into the facility's operation in the event that a motorist were to encroach in the buffer or vice versa. Another variant of these is actually elevating the bike lanes, raising them up, starting to see more of these, or putting them behind a curb and having a curb separated bike lane. And again, once you have curbs on either side, the width of the bike lane becomes very important. That you really need 6.5 feet minimum for bicyclists to be able to pass each other safely here, not be operating too close to the edge of the curb. Here's an example of a facility that doesn't have a curb, but it has parking. And it really this photo gives a contrast to the difference between, these larger vehicles that are operating on the roadway and the cyclists, and the great risk that can come in the event of a collision. And here's an example of a two-way separated bike lane next to a sidewalk. And if you this is an example where you have a city, dense urban environment, higher uses of cycling, higher rates of people walking. And in this case, there's a desire to separate the two, and the separation is achieved vertically with a 2-inch change of elevation on the bike lane here. A little bit on rural roads. We have a similar chart on rural roads. Tends to be more of a focus on providing shoulders or wider widths because the traffic volume is lower. And so the ASHTO guide is going to provide guidance on when to provide wider widths under different speed and volume combinations. Here's an example of just a shared lane operation, no center line striping. But you can see that the addition of a shoulder can make a big difference in where people tend to operate and their sense of comfort. And it can even provide side paths in a rural environment, and they can be desirable when you're connecting towns or regional parks or locations where you anticipate a lot of families or children, or it's an important bike route. These are becoming increasing alternatives to the roadway design. And then another, I think, strategy that many agencies are starting to focus on is like trouble points, locations of steep grades where they can do some spot widening, locations with inadequate sight distance around curves where some very targeted widening can improve safety outcomes for people operating in the rural roadways and stretch DOT maintenance budgets. Here's another example. And when space is available, there's a real desire to provide a stripe because you can really see the difference between providing a stripe and not providing a stripe of setting expectations for people of where to be and where to operate. And again, when you're operating at night, that can have a big difference in safety. A lot of people are not taking advantage of this, but there's flexibility in lane widths. The default is to use 4-inch or 6-inch wide lane striping, but you actually have permission under the METC to use wider lane striping, 8 to 12 inches, to add emphasis. So this is something that some state agencies are starting to do. And a more important consideration when it comes to safety in rural areas is considerations of rumble strips. They have a real safety value for motorists, but they can degrade the safety of cyclists if they're designed improperly. So the guidance is that if you can't provide enough width between the shoulder stripe and the edge of the paved surface to provide a full width shoulder space of at least 4 feet to 6 feet, that the rumble strip themselves should be relocated to the edge of the roadway. So you don't create a shoulder that's too narrow to safely ride on. And we also need to provide some separation in the rumble strip, some gaps, so that cyclists have the opportunity to exit the shoulder as needed. Special considerations with center of the road rumble strips, again, can be very positive in reducing head-on collisions between motorists, but they can actually reduce the research shows that they can discourage motorists from changing lanes. And this can be a challenge on roadways that don't have adequate width shoulders, or the lanes are too narrow, and result in close passing of cyclists. So if you have a situation like that, the use of rumble strips may not be a good idea if you have a lot of cycling. It may be better to use raised pavement markers, which achieve the same rumble effect for motorists, but have been shown through research to not have that same it doesn't inhibit motorists to cross and change lanes as much as the rumble strips do. An emerging technology, an emerging treatment is the idea of an advisory shoulder. I'm not going to explain it too much other than to say that it's for low volume streets, it's experimental, and the idea here is that motor vehicles operate two-way in the center, and when they encounter a motor vehicle coming towards them, they pull into the designated shoulder space to let the other motorists pass. And so the idea behind this is to create a safe walking and biking space for much of the time and really act as a traffic calming strategy for motorists. So you may start to see more of these treatments around the U.S. And I'll wrap up and say that from a research standpoint is that it's been consistent since the 70s that both bicyclists and motorists prefer separation. Bike lanes have consistently shown themselves to be safer than shared lanes. Bicyclist crash risk increases when bicyclists operate facing traffic, whether they're in shared lanes or bike lanes or sidewalks. And that bike operating speeds have been pretty consistent for decades, that they tend to be at the lower end of the spectrum. And then when it comes to sidewalk and side path safety risk, again, there's some facts that we've known historically that when you ride with traffic, your risk is about the same as operating in a shared lane, or in some cases lower, based on numerous research studies. But what's been conflated and I think misreported about some of the sidewalk safety studies is there's a difference. When you actually separate out whether cyclists are operating on sidewalks facing traffic or riding with traffic, that's where there's a difference. And I think we need to be careful when we talk about sidewalk riding and side path riding about what direction people are operating in. That the elevated risk associated with sidewalk riding, it happens from contraflow riding. And another aspect of sidewalk riding and side path riding that can lead to higher crashes, although not reported with motorists, is collisions with signs and poles. And you can see in the slides additional research on separated bike lanes. Again, it kind of reinforces the side path safety that, again, when you ride with traffic, you tend to be safer than when you're operating in shared lanes or bike lanes, and that there can be an elevated crash risk when you're operating facing traffic in a separated bike lane. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up for questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bill. That was great. I really enjoyed seeing all that, and some of those animations are really good too. I'm going to take the screen back from you, so just hold tight, and we'll get into some Q&A period. The first question I want to bring up has to do with some comments that we got following when we put these animations out last week. We've got some comments back about one issue I wanted to raise here, which is in the role of different things to help prevent this problem, policy, design, maybe behaviors. We focused some attention in the animation and the video on things that drivers could do differently. We got some comments back asking about what could a bicyclist do? Is it reasonable to assume or expect a bicyclist to take some action to maybe help prevent this crash from happening? And several references were to a bicyclist maybe taking control of the full lane to maybe prevent or deter the motorist from passing. This idea of taking the lane as an evasive maneuver or a preventive maneuver to keep the crash from happening. Bill, you highlighted some slides showing some corridors where it just may not be realistic to expect bicyclists to take the lane in all situations. I wonder if you might be able to respond to that. Have you heard that argument before? And is there how did we fit taking the lane into this spectrum of solutions that we've laid out?
Well, I think this has been a strategy that's been advocated for over 50 years as a solution to this crash type, and it can help sometimes. And I think the reality is that it's possibly the best you can do in a shared lane situation to be more visible, but there's no research that documents that it is in fact safer than edge riding. There's really no research that shows one strategy or the other is safer. It's really based on a logic presumption that you're more visible. And I think when you consider the fact that such a high percentage of fatalities are occurring now in shared lanes, regardless of whether they're on the edge or in the middle, they're being hit by a car behind them, who in theory that driver should be able to see them regardless. And so the question is, are we should we rely on education as the strategy to solve this problem, or should we actually use the engineering tools that we have to make sure it's safe? And I think you have to really think about the fact that there's such a difference of daytime and nighttime that your strategy needs to work at all times of day. And so it's very clear in the research over the period of 50 years that separating cyclists from traffic with their own space is the safer alternative when you can do it.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's well summarized. I think we do, as Ken pointed out in his slides, and Bill, you echoed as well, it's this idea of, not just one strategy, but this combination of strategies, the system of approaches that we can look to all different manner of things. And I think you all have done a great job laying all those out. I've got some questions. I'm going to get through as many as possible as we have this Q&A period. We do have some contact information for all of our panelists up on the screen, but I wanted to go ahead and start, Ken, with you. The 3-foot passing law, that does seem to be taking hold in a lot of places across the country. Some questions about what we know maybe about the effectiveness of these laws on reducing crashes. My initial thought is that they may not have been in place for long enough to really know, but I wonder what your response to that would be. I'm sure you get questions about, well, are these really effective, or is it just a policy?
Yeah, so far the studies that exist out there don't show a huge effectiveness. If you look at NHTSA's countermeasures that work, they reference one study that dealt with safe passing law after it was enacted in Maryland. Maryland's safe passing law is a little weirdly unique in that it has a lot of exceptions. That shouldn't affect its effectiveness or not for the purpose of the study. And really, they found that they couldn't observe any effectiveness with 5 bicyclists being overtaken 500 times in the study period. They found things like bike lanes were more effective at increasing passing distance than the enactment of the law. There are some kind of analysis of multiple studies, including one that is in my slide, and the link is on the picture of the study, kind of looking internationally to see if there's any real evidence. And again, there's no conclusive evidence that safe passing laws alone are effective. Safe passing laws plus bike lanes plus public education may have some effect, but it's also just, we have limited data, and these have only been around for a decade or less in a lot of states. And in many states, the impetus has really come from advocates, not the state. There's not the same kind of public safety messaging funding that there might be for seatbelts or distracted driving campaigns. So I think the lack of data at this point really shows the need to invest more in public education and driver training around these laws than any deficiency in the laws themselves. Okay.
Wonderful. And to keep it here, Ken, another policy or another law I think that more people are familiar with might be the requirement for bicyclists to use rear reflectors or rear lights or LEDs even. Is this, this has been around a little bit longer. Do you see that as a strategy or a law that could help address this crash problem as well, just with the visibility issues and maybe some nighttime crashes?
Yeah, certainly more visibility is always going to be good for an individual bicyclist. I believe most states have a rear red light law. All of them definitely have red rear reflector laws. So those have been on the books for a long time. To the extent that, lights are getting better and better in terms of output for size, how long they last. I would definitely encourage everyone biking to have a good front and rear light.
Great, thank you for that. I wanted to ask a question about the data. Libby shared a lot of data with us earlier. One thing we don't know, Libby, is much about exposure. To look at, we can see trends in fatalities and crashes over time, but we don't have a good sense of how much people are bicycling. There was some speculation as we showed that rising trend in North Carolina, at least of those crashes involving motorists overtaking bicyclists. People were asking, well, are we seeing maybe, could we assume that maybe bicycling is going up at that same pace? I wanted to ask you that question of what we do and don't know about exposure that might help make more sense of this.
Yeah, that's certainly a good hypothesis about what might be going on, but unfortunately, we don't have good data at a state level over that time period, and just taking some snapshots in these U.S. national surveys isn't providing a clear picture about that. Fortunately, North Carolina and other places are among those starting to develop sampling strategies to get better data on the amounts of riding and location types for riding. So hopefully we'll be able to answer those questions in the not too many more years.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So Ken, another one for you that just came up a few times. I wanted to address this. An image you showed on one of your policy slides had the image of the bicycle, or the vehicle passing the double yellow to pass the bicyclist. And I know that I've heard of some examples of states that have gone to adjust the policy language to specifically allow the double yellow passing. There's some concern among some folks that, oh, well, don't we have those zones for a reason, the no passing zones, and should we be allowing people to pass on double yellow lines? And I'm sure this is something you've probably heard a lot in your work. I wonder how you typically respond to that double yellow issue.
Yeah, so our position is really the double yellow issue is less concern when a motorist is overtaking a bicyclist than when they're overtaking another vehicle, simply because bicyclists are slower and smaller than motor vehicles, so that pass is going to be a lot quicker, more easy to accomplish. In our model law, we do address this by making sure that we make a reference to all of the constraints on passing that are present in the Uniform Vehicle Code, so that, you know, a double yellow coming up to a blind curve is different than a double yellow on a straightaway. There's many things that affect whether a pass can be safe or unsafe, and we still want motorists to be taking those things into effect. But in terms of like a straightaway with a double yellow, it's simply a very different passing maneuver passing a bicyclist than a motor vehicle in that circumstance. And that's kind of the thing that we want to address by allowing passing in that circumstance.
Excellent. Great. Thanks very much. I have a question, I guess, it may be for Bill, maybe for Libby. If agencies are considering, okay, this is a problem, we want to explore further the overtaking crash, are there good strategies in place or things agencies could use to maybe model or look at a corridor and maybe look for some factors where they may want to begin targeting this problem? It may be showing up in their crash data, but it may not be, and if they're going to be proactive about solving it, what sort of roadway factors would you recommend? Maybe I'll ask Libby, and then Bill, if you want to jump into to kind of look at, okay, this is how we can begin to identify some locations that may be of concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So Bill mentioned systemic safety, and this is the kind of problem that by looking at these national data, for instance, that helps us start to look at, you know, what are the big picture factors we tend to see in these types of fatalities, and then using the North Carolina data for fatal and serious injuries. So you may really want to start at a high level but when we even look at those data just for the whole state of North Carolina, it is still hard to get a picture of what's going on because the numbers are relatively small. That's a good thing, but it makes it difficult to identify specific locations and issues. So I'd encourage you to look at this kind of research, say, okay, we know that higher speeds, higher volumes, Bill pointed this out too, these are a problem. The other variables you would really want to look at are your land uses. I think Bill also addressed some of these factors. Where are bicyclists most likely to need to ride? What are the locations that they need to be able to connect between? So those are the kinds of things you need to look at to start prioritizing maybe which to do first. But at a high level, you can really think about a complete streets and a policy approach, bringing Ken into the conversation, you know, and just not building more types of roads that cause these kinds of issues. So really thinking, when you have higher speeds, higher volumes, how do you provide the separation needed to protect more vulnerable road users?
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, it's no mystery what we need to do. I think the problem is the money it's going to take to retrofit a system that was improperly built to be safe for people to make mistakes. And I think that's the hard part. So I think the systemic safety analysis can allow you to target certain areas to target spending your money. I think it's a combination of where the demand is, but also known contributing factors, this location, rural roads with visibility problems on curves, those should be prioritized for shoulder widenings. In urban areas, streets with high volumes of traffic, the shared lane marking was a hope that it would help encourage people to control the lane and be in the lane. But the fact is, at the volumes that we're dealing with in a lot of these locations, that's not going to happen. So what can we do? We need an actual alternative and a focus to build alternatives that create a safe environment for the users.
Great. Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Bill. One question gets back to, Ken, a topic you touched on, and it's a sentiment, I guess, that the idea behind the passing law, the new passing laws, maybe even other laws that we can put on the books are great, but it's all about that enforcement of them. And some participants have maybe had a history of not getting law enforcement totally bought in on some of these topics. Passing a new law and enforcing a brand new law can be a tough sell. And you touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you have any recommended strategies to share about maybe starting that conversation with law enforcement and explain. Maybe it starts with just education about why the law is important, not necessarily dropping it on their laps and saying enforce this now. Can you share any experience or any recommendations you'd have on bridging that gap with law enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think a great way to help law enforcement understand this is always just to invite them out on a ride. Go for a ride with them, talk about why you feel it's important to you, what benefit you think the safe passing law brings to your community, and just get them to kind of have some experience like you've had. And I've heard of that being effective. With Ohio, it took them, I want to say, 8 years to get their safe passing law passed. And part of what was effective there was taking legislators on a ride. I think they had law enforcement on a ride there. So I would say, if law enforcement isn't being receptive, go out to them, be proactive, and just kind of try to get involved with them.
Great. Thanks very much. I wanted to kick things back over to Bill. Bill, a few things you mentioned. This is not even really that closely on topic, but it's a question that's come up a lot. I wanted to answer it. You shared a lot of ideas about what's going to be coming in the AASHTO guidance, and there are so many people interested in that AASHTO guidance, and I wonder if you can give us a preview or a sense of when folks might see that.
Sure.
Guidance.
So we've finished the draft for our NCHRP part of the process. So that's draft was approved by the NCHRP panel. The draft is currently being reviewed by the non-motorized committee at AASHTO. We're going to get comments from them in the next month or two, in which case we'll make revisions, and then it'll circulate back to the AASHTO committee, various AASHTO committees for their review, and when they sign off, hopefully by next spring, it'll go to balloting to formally be adopted as the new edition. So we're working on a timeline where our expectation is there'll be a new AASHTO bike guide at the end of 2019 at present. Now all that's subject to the approval process and the review process, but we're pretty optimistic we'll stay on track.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. I know a lot of people are anxious for that, and I think we got a great look at some of the items that might be in it there, and collectively with all the presentations today, I think a really nice breaking down of the problem, of what we know about it, and some very different ideas about what could be done to prevent this problem moving forward. I'm sad to say that that's the time we have left for questions. We do have contact information up here, email account. If you want to get in touch with us about this or some of the other crash types we've been looking at, I'd encourage you to do that. We do have one more webinar coming up on Thursday, the multiple threat crash. We'll be kind of unpacking that one and looking at some solutions there. And with respect to pedestrians that time. And then two other crash types that we'll focus on a little bit later this summer will be the right hook crash, where a motorist turns right in front of a bicyclist traveling in the same direction, and then a left turning crash at a signalized intersection where a motorist strikes a pedestrian. So those will both be turning crashes. It'll be a bit of a different flavor, but we do plan to kind of look at the same types of information. So I hope that you'll keep us on your radar, sign up for our mailing list so you'll get information about those webinars coming up. Again, just a reminder, you'll get an email from me later today with a link to the webinar material, the recording, a link to the certificate of attendance that you can use, all that good stuff. We'll also be sharing information about our next webinar, and a very brief survey will greet you as you close out of this session today. We'd appreciate some time, if you have it, to share your thoughts with us about the session today and maybe sessions you'd like to see more in the future. I'd like to thank you all again for attending this webinar, and I'd specifically like to thank Libby Thomas, Ken McLeod, and Bill Schulteis for their wonderful presentations this afternoon. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks very much, everybody.